Welcome back to the Control the Freak podcast, where we talk about all things control freak related. Whether you're a controlling person who wants help to understand why you do the things you do and how you can stop it, or you live with or know somebody else who lives with a controlling person, and you want to understand how to either navigate that behaviour or when and how you can extract yourself from it. My name's Sean Johnson, and I'm going to walk you through all of the above. In the last episode, I walked you through what creates a control freak. We talked about events, drive, and permission. You have an event that creates a controlling urge, the drive that drives it forward, and how we actually need permission to be able to carry on doing what we do. And at the end of that episode, I spoke about how I keep seeing scenarios nowadays where there's a claim of control. She's controlling him, he's controlling her, etc. And how, to my eyes, there probably is some control present, but it's not necessarily how you think it is. And today we're going to give you a foolproof method on how to identify controlling motivation in any interaction. I did a straw poll a few years ago with people I worked with, people I know, and I asked them to tell me in one word the image that came to mind whenever they heard the word control. And I got some pretty varied answers. I got the government, I got the BBC, and you can make of these what you will, depending on your point of view. I got Switch, and that's related to the work that I do, the industry that I'm in. And I got vaccine, and again, this tells you around about the time that I was asking the question. It's not really what we're talking about, though, is it? So I extended the question, and I said, what about controlling person? Same exercise, first image that comes to mind. And then I heard things like manipulation, bullying, strict, angry, and it went on. Things like stalking, etc. Which is much more like it, isn't it? That's what we're looking at here. But even then, it's quite vague, isn't it? You can't really twin manipulation with aggression. They don't quite go together, do they? You can't really equate strictness with manipulation either. Still quite vague. And unfortunately, I'm briefly going to muddy the waters a little bit more for you. There is a type of control freak whose drive is very separate to the kind of drives we were just talking about there, because manipulation and bullying, stalking even, have a focus. They have a victim. For this type of control freak that I'm going to describe now, their focus is on not being controlled, and they create chaos all around them. Everyone around them is confused, angry, unsettled. But if you're to watch that person, they're kind of in the eye of the storm. They're kind of calm while all this is going on around them. They look quite relaxed, or they might even just look happy that it's going on. That person is a chaotic control freak. As I say, their focus is on stopping anybody else controlling them, and they see it everywhere. Justified, unjustified, real or untrue, they're on the constant lookout for control that they're not going to put up with. Like the other guy in the last episode, they're looking out for shit they're not going to take. And he was a chaotic control freak. You wouldn't have thought there was any control involved in what he was doing, because he was just abrasive, disruptive. You couldn't ask him about anything he'd done, and you couldn't ask him to do something. He just wasn't going to play the game, no matter what. I also know chaotic control quite well myself, and I've seen it so many times. When I was younger, going through my school days, I was an awful student. I was really, really badly behaved. I'd already had my first event at home, and I was reacting to it. And I was reacting to it the way that a lot of naughty kids do. Because if you think about the power that kids have, we can manipulate, and they can bully other kids to some degree. But really, there's not much payback in that. There's not much reward. The biggest reward comes if you can control your environment and control adults. And the way to do that for a child is through chaotic control. And so that's what I did. At school, I wouldn't be controlled, and I was on the lookout for it constantly. You couldn't tell me what to do, and you couldn't get me to do what you wanted me to do. I was going to control that. I was so bad that by the time I got to high school, we call it now, I guess, I already had a reputation, and it was there waiting for me. And I rocked up to my first day of school. And I was lining up for my first assembly. I got a tap on the shoulder. It was a female teacher. And she said, "Are you Sean Johnson?" "Yeah." "Right, follow me." And she turns on her heels and she marches down to the reception area where there's a lineup of teachers waiting for me when I get there. And the long and short of it was that they said to me, "Right, we've heard all about you. We know what you're like, and you're not going to get away with that here." And obviously they didn't understand chaotic control either. They just thought I was just a naughty child, and what they were trying to do was apply some control to the situation. But by then I was an expert. I'd already worked out chaotic control, and I just escalated, like all control does. I just escalated my behaviour. I started setting my alarm an hour early, and I would go and break into school. I found a door that was open one morning, or I might have been told about it, and I started breaking into school. And I would spend the first hour of each day while they were trying to set up for the day's learning and for the day's pupils to arrive. I tried to do everything I could to make sure that didn't go smoothly. And I got away with it for a couple of weeks as well. Spent an hour every morning being chased around the school by teachers and cleaners. It was a lot of fun, but also I'm sure I was a right pain in the backside. It didn't stop there either. When I got into classrooms, I was even worse. There wasn't a lesson that was allowed to proceed or complete when I was there. Basically, I made sure of that. No teacher was allowed to do their job. They'd try and send me to detention. I'd just leave. I'd just go home. There was no way they were going to control me. I was making everything as chaotic around me, breaking every rule that I could to make sure that I remained in control. So there again, if you look at chaotic control, that's quite different to bullying, although there was certainly a little bit of that in it. There's quite different to anger, although there was certainly a bit of that in it. But my focus was on not being controlled. So again, going back to that example of control might be there, but it's not how you think it is. You can see how chaotic control can kind of play into that equation. In fact, I think quite often it is when we look at these interactions that I'm talking about. But as I say, no matter what the control, I actually have an equation to be able to work your way through the problem, and you'll be able to identify who is trying to control who. And the equation goes something like this. You need to look for demand, you need to look for disproportionate benefit, and you need to look for escalation. This equation works perfectly if we can apply three things: honesty, personal responsibility, and objectivity. Before we get into it, I should probably touch on something. I have a radar, I have a rule of thumb for controlling behaviour, and every time I spot a new type or a type that's familiar, I log it. And in the last couple of years I've been made aware of a concept that blew my mind that people were falling for it, called my truth. If I'd had access to a saying that was endorsed like my truth when I was younger, going through my school days, I would have ripped the backside out of that. That would have been my full stop to every time I was questioned about my behaviour. It's my truth, it's my point of view, and that point of view is my truth. I'm exasperated when I hear politicians and journalists endorsing the idea of my truth as if it's a thing. If you want to avoid controlling behaviour and controlling people, you won't endorse the idea of my truth. There is the truth, and there is your perspective on it, and that's all it is. And what you don't want to do is give people, like I used to be, and other control freaks, an idea that they can project the idea of my truth and that you're just going to swallow it. Anyway, on with the equation. So again, the equation is demand, disproportionate benefit, escalation. And it goes something like this. I'll give you two examples. There's a lot of angry groups around nowadays. They're everywhere, aren't they? Protesting this, protesting that. Some of it's perfectly justified, and I'm sure to each one of those people, from their personal perspective, it's all justified. But if you want to understand the motivation behind it, you'll work this equation. So let's start with one of those groups. Let's look at Just Stop Oil, for instance. Just Stop Oil is a funny one because it's very clear already that they're coming from the position of demand. But let's pretend they're not. Let's pretend this is a reasonable approach. If they come from a reasonable approach and they say to the government, we want to talk to you about just stopping oil, That's perfectly reasonable. And a reasonable approach deserves a reasonable response. So the government should say, well, you're voting citizens, you have a voice, we'll talk to you about it. So the conversation starts. During that conversation, we need to ascertain what their motivation is. And depending on the answers they give, depending on the answers we know we've got, if they can come to the government and they can say, we want you to just stop using oil because we've got irrefutable proof that using oil is going to kill everybody, it's going to damage the planet, and it's for everyone's benefit that we stop, and it's irrefutable, then the government should listen to that and they should talk to these people. If, however, at this point they show that things change in a disproportionately beneficial to them, red flags should go up. If they say things like, it's cruel, we just don't like it, for instance, if they were to use those arguments, it makes us feel sad, then it's disproportionately beneficial to just stop oil, that we just stop using oil. If we really want to be sure, we move to the last part of the equation, and the last part of the equation is escalation. If they've been reasonable up to now, just stop oil, and they've given irrefutable evidence and they've argued calmly, then at this point the government needs to go away and think about their response. If, however, the government says, okay, well, what if we can't meet your request? And then just stop oil say, well, we're going to disrupt. We're going to block every motorway. We're going to occupy the West End. We're going to throw paint on artwork. We're going to disrupt live broadcasts. Then that's an unreasonable escalation. And it's likely, knowing control like I do, that end point was always in the back of their mind anyway. To escalate that badly, they probably always had that in mind, that if the government don't agree, we're going to do this. And that should tell you that it was never a request. It was always a demand. Before the conversation even started, it was a demand. That's quite a simple one. But remember, I said this works with personal responsibility and objectivity. So we need to look at both sides of the argument, don't we? And to do that, we're going to take two people. And this can be a man and a woman, a man, it can be a couple, it can be friends, or it can be someone that you just interact with. But on this occasion, I'll just use two names. I'll use Dave and I'll use John. And Dave has a problem with something John's doing, so he makes an approach. Dave goes to John and he says, along the lines of, I want to talk to you about X behaviour. Now, there's a couple of ways that Dave can do this. Dave can approach from an outright demand. If you don't stop doing that, I'm going to do this. That's a demand. And just like a reasonable approach should be met with reasonable response, a demand should be met with refusal, because a demand is a sign of somebody trying to take control, and we don't want to give them that. So if somebody says, you stop doing that or else, and you're in a position to, your response should be, come back to me when you want to talk about it. Dave could also approach from an implied demand as well. He could say something along the lines of, you keep doing X and I've had enough. There's a hint there that John's already reaching breaking point and that he's already quite wound up. Now, Dave might be justified in this. There might be something that John's been doing that's already brought him to this point before he even approached him. Let's say, for instance, that Dave starts the conversation with, John, I'd really like to talk to you about X. Reasonable request, reasonable response. So the conversation begins. John wants to know what Dave's problem is, and they have this conversation. Now, it's possible that Dave might have extenuating circumstances as to why he needs to bring this subject up. Whatever John's doing might affect Dave's family. It might affect Dave's ability to get up for work. It might affect, I don't know, his ability to earn money. That's reasonable, isn't it? And the conversation should progress. But at this point, if Dave just says, I don't like it, pisses me off, that thing that you do, then any change in the status quo is disproportionately beneficial to Dave. And red flags should start showing here. They're not all the way up, but they should start showing. We should start questioning things. Still, There isn't a line in the sand at the moment because John's a reasonable person. So we move to the final end point. If John has been reasonable all the way through and we've got to the escalation point, and John isn't really ready to give ground on it because he thinks everything he's doing is reasonable and is reasonable, then if Dave escalates, if Dave ends the conversation with, right, well, I'm telling you, if you do it again, you're going to get it, that's escalation. And just like Just Stop Oil at the beginning, it's likely he already had that end point in mind. So Dave was always trying to take control, and it was never a request, it was always a demand. But we need to look at both sides, don't we? So now let's look at John. John is on the receiving end of this approach. Dave has approached John, and he's approached him reasonably, for the sake of argument here, because we've decided what he would do if Dave approached from a point of demand. So let's say that Dave is being reasonable. John has a duty to react reasonably to Dave's approach. If John escalates at this point, straight away at the point of approach, then John assumes the position of demand and control, because it's likely that John really is the problem. Dave might not have approached him up until now because of John's reaction, because he knew what he was going to get. But then let's say it goes well, this first part of the equation, and we need to work out whether or not we've got a control situation. So the conversation progresses. Dave gives a reasonable argument as to why John should stop doing what he's doing. He uses the extenuating circumstances. You know, it affects my kids, it affects my job. This might not be true, but it might well be true as well. But also, John could say, yeah, I hear all that. I don't care. I like doing this thing. This thing makes me feel good. Well, then the disproportionate benefit is with John. And again, it's likely that he potentially was the problem anyway. The red flags are up. We're starting to question how this is going to go. But if we want to be sure, we move to the final part, the escalation. Let's say, for instance, Dave's been reasonable all the way through the first two parts of the equation. He made a request and he was reasonable about the reason for that request. Well, if John kicks off at this point, stamps his feet and says, I don't care what you're saying, I'm going to carry on doing it, and by the way, you can piss off, then John absolutely was the problem. He assumes control, he assumes the position of demand, and those two probably shouldn't spend any more time together. But it could go the other way. John could say, all right, I've heard everything you say, Dave, and actually I think you're right. I'm not responsible for how you feel, but I don't want to hurt your feelings, so I'm going to stop. And then everything's hunky-dory, isn't it? They're friends and they can move on, or they can agree to disagree, it doesn't matter. But nobody's trying to snatch or retain control at this point. So let's go over the equation again. We have demand, disproportionate benefit, and escalation. And it doesn't matter how complicated the situation might be, those 3 pointers will guide you through this, and you'll identify a controlling motivation in any interaction. I worked this equation with somebody a few weeks ago. I was trying to walk them through it, and they couldn't get past the personal responsibility thing, the personal perspective idea. And he said, well, if you said something to me or done something to me that upsets me and I get upset, that's your fault. My argument against that comes in a couple of forms. I could walk into a room full of 10 people and I could say the worst thing you could say to those 10 people and I wouldn't get a universal response. Think of the most heinous thing you could accuse somebody of. I still wouldn't get the same response. This person might want to hit me. This person might think it's funny. This person might just walk away. This person might actually hit me. This person might argue with me, and so on and so on. It doesn't matter what it is. The worst thing you can think of, there is no such thing as a universal response, because there's so many cultures in the world that think different things for a start, and we're all products of our own upbringing and our own inputs. So universal responses are impossible. You have understandable responses, you can have fairly predictable responses, but none of them are universal. If I say something bad to you, I retain responsibility for what I've said, by the way. If I set out to upset you, I retain responsibility for that. But the second you start to react, you take some of that responsibility. I'm not absolved at all, because we're all responsible for the things that we do. But if you take responsibility for how you react, we can start to work our way out of the problem. What you don't want to do is give somebody, like I used to be, and other control freaks, the idea that they have control over your reactions, because that's what they need. If you think about the guy I told you, the guy that I used to work with, he relied on reactions, and you don't want to give that to control freaks. It's the worst thing you can possibly do. Throughout this equation we spoke about language, didn't we? It's all about communication and how we react to the things that people say. It's very, very important to be able to learn how to do that in ways that will save you. In the next episode, we're going to look at words. We're going to look at communication and the early warning signs that you need to look for with controlling people, and how they will use your responses to inform their next step, their next move on the chessboard. So hopefully you'll join me for that. Just before I go, a little idea my partner had about a little competition we can run, or just a way we can get some feedback. There's a thing on Reddit called Am I the A-hole? Well, I want to open it up to Am I the control freak? So drop something in the comments if you've got a scenario or a question about, is this controlling, is that controlling? I'll work my way through them. What I'd love to do is encourage some feedback, because the whole idea of this channel is to help people to clarify what control is to people. So please go ahead and do that. In the meantime, I'll leave you with the usual: control the freak, not other people, and I'll see you next time.